November 12, 1944. The Belgian town of Spa sat shrouded in early morning fog, its cobblestone streets still bearing the scars of recent conflict. Inside a commandeered warehouse that now served as a repair depot for American armored units, the temperature hovered just above freezing, and the air hung heavy with the smell of motor oil, welding sparks, and strong coffee. Sergeant James William Carter of the 761st Tank Battalion stood hunched over the exposed engine of a medium tank M4A3E8 Sherman, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he worked with a precision that bordered on reverence. What the German officer who would arrive later that morning believed about American industrial capability, and what he assumed about the capabilities of the men who maintained these machines, would prove so fundamentally wrong that it would shake his understanding of the conflict itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What would unfold over the next 72 hours would transform a moment of casual prejudice into a profound lesson about innovation, expertise, and the unstoppable force of human ingenuity when combined with industrial might. The encounter between these two men would reveal not just the technical superiority of American engineering, but something far more powerful, the realization that talent, dedication, and brilliance recognize no boundaries of race or nation. James Carter had been working on engines since he was 8 years old in the small town of Tuskegee, Alabama, where his father ran a repair shop that serviced everything from tractors to the occasional automobile that passed through their rural community. By the time he was 16, James could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, identifying the precise cylinder misfiring or bearing wearing thin before ever opening the hood. His hands possessed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the vibrations and rhythms of mechanical systems, and his mind worked through problems with a methodical brilliance that his high school physics teacher, Mr. Jonathan Reynolds, had once described as genuinely exceptional. Young James had spent countless hours in that garage, learning not just the practical skills of mechanical repair, but developing an intuitive understanding of how systems worked together. His father, Samuel Carter, had been a patient teacher who understood that his son's gifts extended far beyond simple mechanical aptitude. Samuel had scraped together money to buy technical manuals and engineering textbooks, materials that James devoured with the hunger of someone who recognized that knowledge was the key to transcending the limitations that society tried to impose on him. The garage had been a sanctuary of sorts, a place where competence mattered more than the color of one's skin. Farmers who needed their tractors repaired quickly learned that the young Carter boy could solve problems that stumped more experienced mechanics. They might harbor prejudices about race in general, but when their livelihoods depended on getting equipment running again, they pragmatically accepted that James possessed skills they needed. It was an education in the complex relationship between capability and recognition, between individual achievement and systemic discrimination. By his late teens, James had begun experimenting with engine modifications, trying to extract more power and efficiency from the aging equipment that came through the garage. He kept meticulous records of his experiments, documenting what worked and what failed, developing an empirical understanding of thermodynamics and mechanical stress that would have done credit to a university-trained engineer. He built his own testing equipment from salvaged parts, creating dynamometers and pressure gauges that allowed him to measure performance with surprising precision. When the war came, James had enlisted with a fire in his heart, eager to prove himself and serve his country, only to find himself assigned to a segregated tank battalion where men of color were initially given the most menial tasks despite their qualifications. The 761st Tank Battalion had formed in the spring of 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, where the men endured not just the rigors of military training, but the additional burden of operating within a system that fundamentally doubted their capabilities. The initial assignments had been demoralizing. Despite his obvious technical knowledge, Carter had been assigned to basic labor details, loading ammunition and cleaning equipment, while less qualified white soldiers operated and maintained the tanks. It had taken the intervention of a white lieutenant named Thomas Bradley, who had observed Carter explaining the finer points of engine timing to another soldier, to get him reassigned to the maintenance section. Bradley had been one of those rare officers who judged men by their abilities rather than their race, and he had fought a quiet bureaucratic battle to ensure that Carter's talents were properly utilized. The transition to maintenance work had been transformative for Carter. Surrounded by complex machinery that most soldiers treated with superstitious caution, he had found his element. The Sherman tanks were fascinating pieces of engineering, mass-produced machines that represented a fundamentally different philosophy from the more artisanal approach of European tank design. Where German tanks were built like expensive watches, with precision-machined parts and complex systems, the Sherman was built like a truck, sturdy, reliable, designed to be maintained by relatively unskilled labor using standardized parts. But Carter had immediately recognized that mass production engineering did not mean the absence of sophistication. The Ford GAA engine that powered the Sherman was a masterpiece of practical design, a high-performance aircraft engine adapted for tank use with clever solutions to cooling, lubrication, and power transmission challenges. The more Carter studied the engine, the more he appreciated the intelligence that had gone into its design, even as he identified areas where improvements could be made. The 761st Tank Battalion had arrived in France in October of 1944, one of the few African-American armored units to see combat in the European theater. The battalion had been held in reserve initially, used for rear area security and logistics support, while white armored units spearheaded the advance through France. But the ferocious German resistance in the Hurtgen forest and the surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes had forced Allied commanders to commit every available unit, and the 761st had finally been given the opportunity to prove itself in combat. The men of the battalion had performed with distinction, their tanks engaging German positions with skill and determination that silenced some of the skeptics, who had questioned whether African-American soldiers could handle the complexities of armored warfare. But casualties had been significant, and the battalion had pulled back to Spa for rest, refitting and repair after several weeks of continuous operations. It was during this lull that Carter had been able to fully implement the engine modifications he had been developing. On this particular morning of November 12, Carter was performing the final adjustments to what he considered his most sophisticated modification yet. The standard Ford GAA engine produced 500 horsepower at 2,600 revolutions per minute, respectable output that gave the Sherman adequate if not exceptional performance. But Carter had identified several areas where the engine's efficiency could be improved, without requiring major redesign or specialized parts. The first modification addressed fuel delivery. The standard carburetor system, while reliable, did not provide optimal fuel atomization at all engine speeds. Carter had developed a modification that improved the spray pattern and droplet size, ensuring more complete combustion in the cylinders. This was accomplished through careful reshaping of the venturi passages and modification of the fuel jets, work that required precision machining but could be accomplished with the equipment available in a field workshop. The second modification focused on cooling efficiency. The Ford GAA ran hot under sustained high-load conditions, a characteristic that reduced engine life and occasionally caused overheating problems during extended operations. Carter had redesigned the water pump impeller to improve coolant flow and had modified the thermostat housing to better regulate temperature. These changes reduced operating temperature by an average of 15 degrees Fahrenheit, a significant improvement that extended engine life and improved reliability. The third modification was perhaps the most elegant. Carter had noticed that the standard exhaust manifold design created back pressure that reduced engine efficiency. By making subtle changes to the manifold configuration and improving the flow characteristics of the exhaust system, he had reduced this back pressure and improved the engine's ability to expel combustion gases. The result was better cylinder scavenging, more complete filling of the cylinders with fresh fuel-air mixture, and consequently improved power output. All of these modifications had been documented in Carter's leather-bound notebook with the precision of an engineering report. He had sketched detailed diagrams, recorded temperature and pressure measurements, calculated theoretical performance improvements, and then validated those calculations through actual testing. The notebook represented hundreds of hours of observation, experimentation, and analysis, a body of work that would have been impressive coming from a professional engineer with access to corporate resources, and was extraordinary coming from a sergeant working in field conditions with improvised equipment. As Carter made final adjustments to the modified fuel delivery system, he was aware of the larger context in which his work existed. The war in Europe was approaching its final phase. Germany was being pressed from east and west, its industrial capacity shattered by strategic air attacks, its armies depleted by years of attrition. Allied victory was no longer a question, but a matter of time and cost. Yet every improvement in equipment performance, every enhancement to reliability and efficiency, translated into saved lives and accelerated victory. If his modifications allowed tanks to operate more effectively, to spend less time in maintenance and more time in operations, then the work had meaning beyond mere technical accomplishment. The warehouse door creaked open, admitting a gust of cold wind and 3 figures who stood silhouetted against the grey morning light. Captain Robert Henderson of the 3rd Armoured Division entered first, followed by 2 German prisoners, being escorted for what had become routine visits to American repair facilities. The practice of allowing captured German technical officers to observe American maintenance operations had become part of a broader psychological warfare strategy that Carter found both crude and effective. The logic was simple. Let them see the abundance of equipment, the efficiency of American logistics, the sheer scale of material superiority that made German victory increasingly impossible. Let them observe the rows of tanks, the mountains of spare parts, the casual wastefulness of a military machine so wealthy it could afford inefficiency. Let them return to prisoner of war camps with stories that would circulate among other captives, eroding morale and reinforcing the futility of continued resistance. It was psychological warfare through demonstration of overwhelming superiority. The first German officer was Hauptmann Friedrich Weiss, a logistics officer in his mid-40s who had been captured near Aachen 3 weeks earlier. Weiss carried himself with the rigid posture of professional military bearing, his uniform still surprisingly clean despite his captivity. He had the look of a career soldier who had served through multiple conflicts, his face lined with the stress of years spent managing the impossible logistics of an increasingly desperate German military. The second was Oberleutnant Karl Richter, younger, perhaps 28 or 29, a technical officer who had served with the 2nd Panzer Division before his capture near the German border. Richter had the bearing of an educated man, someone who had likely attended university before the conflict, whose military service was an interruption of a professional career rather than a vocation in itself. His eyes immediately began cataloguing everything he saw as he entered the warehouse: the rows of tanks in various states of repair, the organized tool stations, the abundance of spare parts stacked on industrial shelving that stretched toward the warehouse ceiling. Captain Henderson led the 2 Germans through the facility with practiced efficiency, explaining in careful English that was translated by Corporal William Martinez, a Mexican-American soldier who spoke fluent German courtesy of a grandmother who had emigrated from Bavaria before the First World War. Henderson gestured toward the various workstations, pointing out the systematic organization of the repair process, the specialization of labor that allowed complex repairs to be completed quickly, the standardization of parts that made maintenance so much more efficient than the German system with its multiple tank designs and non-interchangeable components. Henderson explained how the American system was designed around the assumption that mechanical systems would break down, that failures were inevitable, and that the goal was not to create perfect machines, but to create machines that could be repaired quickly by soldiers with moderate training using readily available parts. This was a fundamental philosophical difference from the German approach, which emphasized technical excellence and precision engineering, but resulted in systems that required specialized expertise and hard-to-obtain components to maintain. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. America's industrial capacity was so overwhelming that it could afford to be efficient, to be wasteful even, to treat these expensive machines as replaceable cogs in an unstoppable military machine. The Germans' technical sophistication was meaningless when their tanks sat broken down, waiting for parts that would never arrive, while American tanks could be repaired in field workshops using supplies that were always plentiful. When they reached Carter's workstation, Henderson paused deliberately. The captain had enormous respect for Carter's abilities and had been fighting a quiet battle with higher headquarters to get the sergeant properly recognized for his innovations. Henderson had submitted multiple reports detailing Carter's modifications and their results, arguing that talent of this caliber deserved official recognition regardless of the soldier's race. The response had been bureaucratically non-committal, acknowledging the technical merit while avoiding any commitment to formal recognition that might challenge prevailing racial attitudes. But Henderson understood that sometimes recognition had to be seized rather than waited for. This moment, with German technical officers observing American capabilities, seemed like an opportunity to demonstrate something important. He watched as Carter's hands moved with practiced confidence, adjusting the timing on the modified fuel injectors, his fingers reading the engine's responses through subtle changes in vibration and sound that most mechanics would never notice. "This is Sergeant Carter," Henderson said, his voice carrying a note of pride that was unmistakable, even through translation. "One of our most skilled mechanics. He's implementing some modifications to improve engine performance. Sergeant Carter has developed these improvements entirely through his own initiative and expertise. The modifications he's making will increase this tank's power output by approximately 12%, while actually improving fuel efficiency." The translator, Corporal Martinez, rendered this information into German with careful precision, ensuring that the technical details were accurately conveyed. Hauptmann Weiss nodded politely, his face neutral and professional. As a logistics officer, he understood the significance of improved fuel efficiency, particularly in the context of Germany's increasingly desperate fuel situation. His expression suggested respect for practical engineering accomplishment, the reaction of a professional appreciating competent work, regardless of its source. But Oberleutnant Richter's expression shifted into something else entirely. His eyes moved from the engine to Carter's face, taking in the sergeant's dark skin, the oil-stained work uniform, the muscular hands that spoke of physical labor. Then his gaze returned to the complex modifications visible in the exposed engine compartment, the precision machining, the careful attention to detail that spoke of sophisticated engineering knowledge. A slight smile played at the corners of Richter's mouth, the kind of smile that carries contempt poorly disguised as amusement, the expression of someone encountering something that confirms their prejudices while simultaneously contradicting them. Richter said something in German, his tone conversational but carrying an edge that needed no translation. The voice had the casual cruelty of someone so certain of their superiority that they felt no need to conceal their contempt. Corporal Martinez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with relaying the comment, his face showing the internal conflict of a soldier caught between duty and decency. Henderson's expression hardened immediately, recognizing the tone even without understanding the words. "What did he say, Corporal?" Henderson's voice had gone flat and cold, the tone of an officer who was preparing to be professionally angry. The translator shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Sir," he said. "He said that it's interesting to see what kind of work the Americans give to their laborers, and that he supposes when one has enough resources, even simple maintenance can be accomplished by anyone. He implied that the sergeant is performing manual labor rather than actual engineering work, sir." The implication hung in the cold air like the visible breath that emerged from their mouths. The other mechanics in the warehouse had gone quiet, their work slowing as they registered what had just been said. Tools that had been moving steadily against metal went still. Conversations that had been conducted in the background ceased mid-sentence. The silence spread through the warehouse like ripples on water as soldiers recognized that something significant was happening at Carter's workstation. Carter's hands paused for just a moment over the engine, the only visible reaction to Richter's words. Then they resumed their work with deliberate calmness, adjusting a fuel line connection with the same careful precision he brought to every task. He had heard such comments before, had faced such assumptions his entire life, and had learned that the best response was always the same: let the work speak for itself. Anger was a luxury he could not afford. Indignation, a weakness that would be used against him. The only viable response was competence so overwhelming that it could not be dismissed or explained away. But Henderson had no such constraints and no patience for such prejudice, particularly when directed at a soldier under his command. The captain's jaw tightened visibly, and his next words came out with the crisp precision of barely controlled fury. "Corporal Martinez, please ask the Oberleutnant about his personal experience with engine modification and performance optimization. I'm very interested to hear about his qualifications in thermodynamic engineering and metallurgical stress analysis." The question was translated, and even in German. The challenge in it was unmistakable. Richter responded with a shrug that managed to convey both casual dismissal and vague condescension. Martinez translated, "He says that he has standard training in maintenance protocols and that German engineering superiority makes such improvisation unnecessary. He adds that the Panzer V and Panzer VI tanks his division operated possessed engines that were far more sophisticated than American designs, requiring properly trained engineers rather than mechanics to maintain them." The response revealed so much about Richter's worldview, about the assumptions that structured his understanding of technical capability and racial hierarchy. In his conception, there was a clear distinction between engineers who designed and understood systems and mechanics who simply followed instructions to maintain them. That Carter might be both, that a black soldier from Alabama might possess engineering knowledge that rivaled or exceeded that of German university graduates, did not fit within Richter's cognitive framework and was therefore dismissed as impossible. Carter straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago absorbed more oil than it could ever remove. He was a tall man, 6 feet and 2 inches, with broad shoulders built from years of manual labor and a face that reflected both intelligence and a quiet strength that came from constantly having to prove himself in a world determined to underestimate him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, with the educated diction that always surprised people who made assumptions based on the color of his skin. "Captain, with your permission, I'd like to ask the Oberleutnant some technical questions about the tanks he mentioned." Henderson nodded immediately, his expression showing both anger at Richter's prejudice and confidence in Carter's ability to address it. "Go ahead, Sergeant. I think technical clarification would be very educational for everyone present." Carter turned to face Richter directly, speaking slowly and clearly so the translator could keep pace with the technical terminology. "The Panzer V, what you call the Panther tank, uses a Maybach HL 230 P30 engine. It's a V12 configuration, 23.0-liter displacement, producing approximately 700 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The engine runs notoriously hot, particularly when operating the traverse and elevation systems simultaneously with the drive system. German crews have reported frequent transmission failures, particularly in the final drive, which has to handle approximately 45 metric tons of vehicle weight, distributed through tracks that are relatively narrow for a tank of that mass. The fuel consumption is approximately 1.6 liters per kilometer under combat conditions, which gives the Panther an operational range of only about 200 kilometers before refueling, less under combat stress when the engine is operating at high load. Am I incorrect in any of these specifications? The translator rendered this into German, his voice betraying surprise at the technical depth and precision of Carter's knowledge. The other mechanics in the warehouse had abandoned any pretense of working, openly watching the exchange with expressions that mixed pride and anticipation. They knew Carter's capabilities, had seen him solve problems that stumped everyone else, and they recognized that he was about to demonstrate exactly why Richter's assumptions were so profoundly wrong. Richter's smile had faded slightly, replaced by a more guarded expression. He responded briefly, confirming that the specifications were essentially accurate, but noting defensively that such information was widely available in technical manuals and captured documents. The implication was clear. Carter was simply reciting memorized facts rather than demonstrating actual understanding. Carter nodded calmly, accepting the response without visible reaction to its dismissive tone. "The reason I ask is because I'm curious about the engineering philosophy that led to those design choices. The Maybach engine produces impressive horsepower, certainly more than our Ford GAA. But the power-to-weight ratio is actually inferior to our Sherman when you account for mechanical reliability and maintenance requirements. The Panther's engine requires approximately 50 hours of maintenance for every 10 hours of operation, assuming you have access to all necessary parts and qualified technicians. Our Ford GAA engine, which the Oberleutnant might consider simple or primitive, requires approximately 12 hours of maintenance for every 20 hours of operation, and that maintenance can be performed by soldiers with moderate training using standardized tools and readily available parts. He paused, letting the translator catch up, then continued with the same calm, methodical delivery. The simplicity isn't a weakness, Oberleutnant. It's a deliberate engineering choice that prioritizes operational readiness over maximum performance. A tank that can produce 700 horsepower, but spends 60% of its time broken down waiting for repairs, is operationally inferior to a tank that produces 500 horsepower, but is available for operations 90% of the time. That's basic mathematics, not sophisticated engineering, but it's mathematics that determines the outcome of conflicts. The warehouse was absolutely silent now, except for the translator's voice rendering Carter's words into German and the slight creaking of the building's structure in the cold wind. Every soldier present understood they were witnessing something significant, a quiet dismantling of prejudice through the undeniable power of knowledge and logic. Carter gestured toward the engine he had been working on, his movements economical and precise. The modifications I'm implementing here address inefficiencies in fuel atomization and combustion chamber temperature management. By improving the carburetor venturi design and modifying the fuel jet configuration, I've achieved better fuel distribution across all cylinders, which improves combustion efficiency. By redesigning the water pump impeller and modifying the cooling system flow, I've reduced operating temperature by an average of 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which extends engine life and reduces the likelihood of overheating under sustained load. By improving exhaust flow through manifold modifications, I've reduced back pressure and improved cylinder scavenging, which increases volumetric efficiency. He picked up his notebook from the workbench, the leather cover worn smooth from constant handling, pages filled with diagrams and calculations. These changes increase power output from 500 to approximately 560 horsepower, while actually reducing fuel consumption by approximately 8%. The engine runs cooler, lasts longer, and gives this tank better acceleration and top speed than the factory specifications. More importantly, these modifications can be implemented by any competent mechanic with access to basic machining tools and salvaged parts. We don't need a factory. We don't need specialized engineers with university degrees. We don't need rare materials or precision-machined components that take weeks to manufacture. I can do this in a field workshop in Belgium in November, using parts scavenged from damaged vehicles. The translator worked to render Carter's explanation into German, occasionally pausing to ensure technical terms were accurately conveyed. Richter's face had lost all trace of amusement. His expression had shifted through several stages. Initial dismissiveness giving way to attention. Attention giving way to recognition. Recognition giving way to something that might have been discomfort or even the first stirrings of doubt. Carter continued, his voice never rising, never betraying anger or vindication, maintaining the calm tone of someone simply stating facts. The Oberleutnant mentioned that I must have learned these specifications from technical manuals, and he's partially correct. I have read every technical manual I could find, American and captured German documents both, but reading specifications and understanding systems are different things. Understanding requires the ability to see how components interact, to identify inefficiencies, to recognize where improvements can be made, to develop solutions, and then test them systematically. He tapped his notebook. Everything I've done is documented in here, every modification, every test, every measurement. The theoretical calculations that predicted the performance improvements, the actual measured results that confirmed those predictions, the refinements I made when initial attempts didn't work as expected. This is engineering methodology, Oberleutnant. Observation, hypothesis, Experimentation, measurement, analysis, refinement. It's not mysterious, and it's not the exclusive province of any particular race or nationality. Richter said something sharp in German, a question that the translator rendered carefully. The Oberleutnant asks where you received your training. What engineering school provided such education? Carter smiled slightly, though the expression carried no warmth, only a kind of weary recognition of a question he had answered many times, in many contexts. I learned engines from my father in a two-bay garage in Tuskegee, Alabama. Everything I know about automotive repair, I learned there working on tractors and trucks and the occasional automobile. I learned thermodynamics from a textbook I borrowed from the colored branch of the public library, a book written for engineering students that I read and reread until I understood every concept. I learned metallurgy from a correspondence course offered by a technical school that didn't ask about race, only about whether you could pay the small fee and do the work. I learned these specific modifications through observation, experimentation and documentation, trial and error, the scientific method. He paused, meeting Richter's eyes directly. That's not complicated German engineering, Oberleutnant. That's just intelligence, curiosity, and persistence. And those qualities aren't limited by nationality or race or any of the other categories that you've been taught, make some people inherently superior to others. Those qualities are human characteristics, distributed across humanity without regard for the artificial boundaries we create. The conflict you're fighting is being lost in part because your ideology requires you to believe otherwise, and wrong beliefs produce bad decisions, flawed strategies, and ultimately defeat. The warehouse remained silent, except for the sounds of the translator rendering Carter's words into German and the distant noise of vehicles moving through the streets of Spa. Richter stood frozen, his face a complex mixture of emotions that flickered too quickly to fully identify. Anger, perhaps, or wounded pride, but also something else, something that might have been the first crack in a worldview built on certainties that were being challenged by undeniable evidence. Henderson stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of command, but also unmistakable satisfaction. The sergeant is being modest. His modifications have been tested on 12 tanks in our battalion. Every single one has shown improved performance within the ranges he predicted. We've documented everything and submitted the findings to Army Ordnance. The Technical Review Board has expressed significant interest, and there's discussion of implementing his changes across multiple divisions. Sergeant Carter's innovations will likely touch thousands of tanks before this conflict ends, improving their performance and reliability in ways that will contribute to operational success and save lives. Before the conversation could continue further, a lieutenant from the motor pool office appeared in the warehouse entrance, calling for Captain Henderson. There was a situation developing that required the captain's immediate attention. Reconnaissance had reported German armored units probing the American positions to the east near the town of Malmedy, and there was concern about a potential counterattack that might be the beginning of a larger operation. Henderson needed to report to division headquarters immediately for a briefing on defensive preparations. Henderson excused himself with obvious reluctance, giving Carter an encouraging nod and a look that conveyed both respect and a promise that this conversation would continue. The captain departed quickly with the lieutenant, leaving the two German officers in the custody of Corporal Martinez and surrounded by the mechanics of the 761st Tank Battalion. The atmosphere had shifted, become charged with a tension that was about more than wartime enmity. The soldiers in the warehouse were predominantly African-American, men who had fought not just against German forces, but against their own army's doubts about their capabilities. They had proven themselves in combat, had demonstrated courage and skill in operations that had helped break through German defensive positions. And here, in this maintenance depot, they had just witnessed one of their own systematically dismantle the prejudiced assumptions of a German officer who had dismissed black capability with casual contempt. Richter stood stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he had created. Hauptmann Weiss, the older logistics officer, said something quietly to him in German. Words that Corporal Martinez did not translate, but which clearly carried the tone of professional reproach. Weiss had the bearing of someone who had seen enough of the conflict to recognize that ideological certainties were luxuries that reality did not always permit. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Corporal Washington, one of the other mechanics, broke it with a comment that carried both humor and an edge. "You know what I love about engines, Sergeant Carter? They don't care about ideology or race or any of that nonsense. You treat them right, understand their principles, give them proper maintenance, and they run. You neglect them, misunderstand them, or abuse them, and they break down. That's pure cause and effect, no prejudice involved." Several other soldiers chuckled, recognizing the broader application of Washington's observation. Carter nodded slightly, acknowledging the comment, but maintaining his professional demeanor. He understood that this moment was being watched and judged, that how he conducted himself would be remembered and discussed, that he was representing not just himself, but all the men who had been dismissed and underestimated because of their race. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, another mechanic who had worked closely with Carter on several projects, added his own perspective. "What gets me is the inefficiency of prejudice. The German military excluded or limited contributions from whole categories of people based on ideology. How many talented engineers, mechanics, scientists did they lose because those individuals had the wrong ancestry or beliefs? How much did that cost them operationally? How many innovations never happened because potential innovators were excluded from opportunities to contribute?" The observation was astute, touching on a fundamental weakness in the German system that went beyond military strategy to the very organization of society. Richter's face had reddened slightly. Whether from cold or anger or embarrassment was difficult to determine. He said something in German, speaking rapidly, his tone defensive. Corporal Martinez translated carefully, clearly uncomfortable with the task, but bound by duty. "The Oberleutnant says that Germany has had to make do with limited resources, that this has forced efficiency and innovation. He says that what appears to be over-engineering is actually the result of making the most effective use of available materials and industrial capacity. He suggests that American abundance allows for wasteful simplicity, while German scarcity demands sophisticated solutions." Carter had returned his attention to the engine, but he responded without looking up from his work, his voice maintaining that same calm analytical tone. Limited resources should drive simplicity, not complexity. Every additional component in a system is another potential failure point, another part that might break and need replacement, another element that requires specialized knowledge to maintain or repair. The reason German tanks are so complex isn't efficiency, it's the opposite. It's what happens when you let perfect become the enemy of good, when you pursue technical excellence at the expense of operational practicality. He straightened up, wiping his hands again on the perpetually oily rag. A Sherman might not be superior to a Panther in any single performance category. The Panther has thicker armor, a more powerful main weapon, better power-to-weight ratio on paper. But the Sherman is good enough in all categories, and we can produce them in quantities that make individual superiority irrelevant. American industry produced approximately 49,234 Sherman tanks in various configurations. How many Panthers did Germany produce? Approximately 6,000, and of those 6,000, how many are currently operational versus broken down somewhere waiting for parts that will never arrive because your supply lines are collapsing and your factories are being destroyed by strategic air attacks? The mathematics were brutal and undeniable, a quantitative argument that transcended qualitative debates about technical sophistication. Richter had no response that wouldn't further prove Carter's point. The German officer's worldview, carefully constructed through years of education, propaganda, and genuine pride in German technical achievement, was encountering the uncomfortable reality that superiority in engineering specifications meant nothing without the industrial capacity to produce and maintain those superior designs in sufficient quantities. Washington spoke up again, his voice carrying a note of dark humor. "We keep these machines running in conditions you wouldn't believe, Oberleutnant. Last week we had a tank throw a track during a river crossing. Water up to our chests, temperature barely above freezing, and we spent 4 hours getting it operational again. Did it in the dark with minimal light because we were in range of German artillery. Try that with your precision-engineered Panthers that need factory conditions for basic maintenance. War isn't a laboratory. It's mud and chaos and equipment breaking down at the worst possible moments, and the side that can keep functioning despite all that is the side that wins. Another mechanic, Sergeant Thomas Blackwell, added his perspective from the opposite side of the warehouse. The Panther might be a better tank than the Sherman in a one-on-one engagement under ideal conditions. I'll grant that. Better armor, better gun, better optics maybe. But we don't fight one-on-one under ideal conditions. We fight 5 Shermans against 1 Panther, and we can replace our losses faster than you can replace yours. That's the reality that ideology can't change. America's industrial capacity is so overwhelming that we can afford to field good enough equipment in unstoppable quantities. Quality has a quantity all its own, the saying goes, but quantity has a quality all its own too. The conversation had taken on the character of a seminar, with the mechanics of the 761st Battalion offering observations that collectively amounted to a comprehensive critique of German strategic and operational decisions. Richter stood in the middle of it all. His earlier confidence completely eroded, replaced by something that looked increasingly like genuine uncertainty about beliefs he had previously held as absolute truths. Corporal Martinez, the translator, had been looking increasingly uncomfortable with his role in this exchange. As a Mexican-American soldier, he occupied his own complex position within the American military's racial hierarchies, neither black nor white, subject to his own forms of discrimination, while simultaneously being used to translate a conversation about prejudice and capability. Finally, he spoke up on his own initiative, rather than simply translating others' words. "If I may say something, sirs," Martinez began, his voice tentative but determined. "My family has been in California for 6 generations, since before it was even part of the United States. We've faced people telling us we don't belong, that we're inferior, that we're only good for manual labor. But my father is a civil engineer who designed bridges and water systems. My uncle is a physician who saved countless lives before the conflict. I'm here translating because I speak 3 languages fluently. Competence exists everywhere, in every community, in every race. The only thing that varies is opportunity and recognition." The comment seemed to strike Richter with particular force. He said something quietly in German, words that Martinez translated as, "I had not considered. I was taught that hierarchy reflects natural capability, that success demonstrates inherent superiority. But if capability is universal, and only opportunity varies, then everything I believed about why Germany deserves to dominate Europe is..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought, but the implications were clear. The foundational ideology that justified the conflict, the belief in German superiority that underpinned expansion and conquest, was being revealed as nothing more than prejudice, rationalized through selective observation and false logic. The escort corporal, Corporal James Riley, who had been standing quietly near the warehouse door, finally suggested that it might be time to return the prisoners to the processing facility. The visit had clearly accomplished its intended purpose of demonstrating American material superiority, but it had also veered into territory that was psychologically complex in ways that made Riley uncomfortable. There was protocol for showing German prisoners American industrial capacity, but protocol did not really cover philosophical discussions about the relationship between ideology and operational failure. As the German officers were being prepared to depart, Richter paused and turned back toward Carter. He spoke directly, in his careful but heavily accented English, clearly having practiced the words or perhaps speaking from genuine impulse. "Your knowledge is impressive. I had not expected." He paused, seeming to realize that finishing the sentence would only make his earlier prejudice more explicit. Then he continued, choosing his words with visible care. "I was wrong to make assumptions based on appearance rather than observation. This is difficult to acknowledge, but it is true." Carter looked up from the engine, meeting the German officer's eyes with a level gaze that held no anger or triumph, only a quiet dignity that was somehow more powerful than either emotion would have been. "You weren't wrong to make assumptions, Oberleutnant. You were wrong to cling to those assumptions after being presented with evidence that contradicted them. We all carry prejudices we learned from our societies, Our educations, our experiences. The question is whether we're capable of recognizing when those prejudices are false and changing our understanding accordingly. That's harder than it sounds, because it requires admitting we were wrong, and human beings hate admitting they were wrong about fundamental things. He paused, then added, "Your ideology is built on the idea that some people are inherently superior to others, based on race or nationality or culture. You're losing this conflict because that idea is fundamentally wrong, and wrong ideas produce bad strategies, flawed logistics, and ultimately defeat. But more than that, wrong ideas waste human potential, exclude talent, and create societies that are weaker than they need to be because they're artificially limiting their own capabilities. I hope that when this conflict ends, you'll remember this conversation and think about what it means for how societies should organize themselves." The warehouse was absolutely silent now, every person present understanding they had witnessed something rare. A moment of genuine communication across the boundaries of war, race, and ideology. Richter stood frozen for a long moment, his face showing complex emotions. Then he nodded once, a small, stiff gesture of acknowledgement, and allowed himself to be escorted out of the warehouse into the cold Belgian morning. After the Germans had departed, the atmosphere in the warehouse slowly returned to something approaching normal, though the mechanics moved with a kind of heightened purpose, as if the exchange had reminded them that their work had meaning beyond mere maintenance. Tools resumed their rhythmic contact with metal. Conversations restarted, though with frequent references to what had just occurred. There was a sense of vindication that went beyond military service to touch something deeper about identity, worth, and the long struggle for recognition. Washington approached Carter's workstation, grinning broadly. "Sergeant, that was the finest piece of technical humiliation I have ever witnessed. You didn't just prove him wrong, you educated him while doing it. You dismantled his worldview with nothing but facts and logic and calm explanations. That German officer is going to be thinking about this conversation for a long time." Carter allowed himself a small smile, though his expression remained thoughtful. The education only matters if he actually learns from it. Most people, when confronted with evidence that contradicts their deeply held beliefs, just dig in deeper. They find ways to explain away the contradiction, to maintain their worldview despite evidence. But sometimes, maybe, the truth gets through. Maybe he'll think about it during the long hours sitting in a prisoner of war camp, with nothing to do but reconsider his assumptions. Maybe it'll plant a seed that grows into actual understanding, or maybe not. Either way, I've got work to finish. He returned his attention to the engine, making final adjustments to the fuel delivery system with the same meticulous care he brought to every task. But the other mechanics weren't quite ready to let the moment pass. Johnson came over, carrying a cup of the strong coffee that sustained them through cold mornings and long shifts. "You know what that conversation really demonstrated?" Johnson asked, handing the coffee to Carter. "It showed that knowledge is power in a very literal sense. That German officer came in here with all his assumptions and prejudices, feeling superior despite being a prisoner, despite Germany losing the conflict, despite everything. And you took him apart with nothing but superior knowledge and the confidence to wield it. No anger, no rhetoric, just overwhelming competence. That's a kind of power that ideology can't touch." Blackwell added his perspective from across the workshop. "It also showed why we're going to win this conflict in the long run, beyond just industrial capacity. We can draw on talent from our whole population. Every capable person, regardless of race, can potentially contribute. Germany limited itself, excluded whole categories of people from contributing to their fullest potential. That's an enormous strategic disadvantage that no amount of technical sophistication can overcome." The conversation continued as the mechanics returned to their various tasks, discussing the implications of the encounter, processing what had happened through the lens of their own experiences with discrimination and the struggle for recognition. For these men, the conflict was about more than defeating Germany. It was about proving to their own country that Black Americans deserved full equality and citizenship, that service and sacrifice should earn recognition regardless of race. Over the next 2 days, Carter completed the modifications to the tank and conducted a series of field tests that documented the improvements with scientific precision. He drove the modified Sherman through a test course that included various terrain types, operating at different speeds and loads, carefully recording temperature readings, fuel consumption figures, and performance metrics. Everything was documented in his notebook, with the same meticulous attention to detail he brought to the modifications themselves. The results confirmed his predictions with remarkable accuracy. The modified engine showed a 12% increase in power output, reducing the time needed to reach maximum speed by approximately 8 seconds. Fuel efficiency improved by 9% under typical operating conditions, extending the tank's operational range significantly. Operating temperature decreased by an average of 16 degrees Fahrenheit, which would extend engine life and reduce the likelihood of overheating during sustained operations. The modifications worked exactly as Carter had calculated they would, a vindication of his methodology and understanding. Captain Henderson submitted a detailed report to Division Headquarters, complete with Carter's technical diagrams, performance data, and recommendations for standardizing the modifications across armored units. The report was accompanied by Henderson's strong endorsement, explicitly noting that the innovations had been developed by an African-American sergeant working in field conditions, that this demonstrated the waste inherent in discrimination and the value of utilizing talent regardless of race. The response from higher headquarters came back within a week, faster than typical bureaucratic processing would suggest. The Technical Review Board had examined the data and found it compelling. They requested that Carter travel to their facility in Rear Area, France, to present his findings directly, and to assist in developing standardized procedures for implementing the modifications across multiple divisions. But the story took an unexpected turn on November 15, when Corporal Riley returned to the warehouse with a strange request. Oberleutnant Richter had specifically asked to speak with Sergeant Carter again, claiming he had technical information about German armored forces that might be valuable to American intelligence. The request had worked its way up through channels to Henderson, who consulted with intelligence officers before deciding to allow a brief supervised meeting. The encounter took place in a small office that had been converted into an interrogation room, though this meeting had a different character than typical interrogations. Richter sat across a simple wooden table from Carter, with Henderson and an intelligence captain named Morris observing from chairs placed along the wall. The German officer looked tired, as though he had not slept well, and there was a different quality to his demeanor, less rigid, more thoughtful, almost uncertain in a way that was striking given his earlier confidence. Richter spoke in his careful English, the words coming slowly as if he had practiced them or was formulating thoughts in real time. "I've been thinking continuously about our conversation, about what you said regarding wrong ideas producing defeat. I wish to share information about German armored doctrine and mechanical vulnerabilities that might be useful to your forces. Not because I wish to betray my country in a simple sense, but because I have come to believe that the conflict is already decided, and that continued resistance will only produce more death for no purpose." Captain Morris, the intelligence officer, leaned forward with obvious interest. Intelligence from technical officers was often more valuable than tactical information because it revealed systematic weaknesses rather than momentary vulnerabilities. "What kind of information are you offering, Oberleutnant?" Richter proceeded to outline a detailed picture of German armored forces' mechanical vulnerabilities and operational limitations. He described specific failure points in the Panther and Tiger tanks, explaining how certain components wore out predictably after specific operational hours, how fuel consumption patterns created predictable vulnerabilities, how the complexity of the transmission systems made them susceptible to particular types of damage. He detailed training deficiencies that had developed as experienced crews were lost and replaced with hastily trained substitutes who lacked the technical knowledge to properly maintain sophisticated equipment. But beyond the specific technical intelligence, Richter kept returning to a broader theme, working through ideas that seemed to be forming even as he spoke them aloud. "We were taught from youth that German engineering was superior because Germans were superior, that our tanks were better designed because we possessed inherent advantages of intellect and character, that the sophistication of our technical systems reflected the sophistication of our culture, and that simpler American designs reflected American cultural and racial inferiority." These ideas were presented not as opinions, but as self-evident facts, as obvious as mathematics or physics. He looked at Carter, his expression carrying something like embarrassment or shame. But sitting in captivity these past days, seeing your operations, witnessing your capabilities, I am confronted with evidence that systematically contradicts everything I was taught to believe. The American system appears crude when measured against German technical specifications, but it functions better operationally because it was designed around different priorities. Your mechanics, many of them from populations that German ideology dismissed as inferior, demonstrate capabilities that exceed those of our supposedly superior personnel. The contradiction between ideology and observable reality has become impossible to ignore. Morris was taking extensive notes, recognizing that this represented more than tactical intelligence. This was the sound of ideological certainty crumbling, of foundational beliefs collapsing under the weight of evidence. If this psychological process was happening to Richter, it was likely occurring among other German prisoners, scattered through Allied camps, each experiencing their own version of the same fundamental recognition. Carter had been listening quietly, his expression thoughtful. When Richter finished speaking, Carter considered his response carefully before speaking. The hard part isn't recognizing that you were wrong, Oberleutnant. The hard part is figuring out what to do with that recognition. You can acknowledge that your ideology was false, that the conflict was based on lies and prejudices, that you participated in something terrible. But acknowledgement alone doesn't undo the harm or rebuild what was destroyed. The question becomes, what do you do with that knowledge? How does it change how you'll live when this is over? Richter nodded slowly, clearly having wrestled with exactly these questions during sleepless nights in the prisoner of war camp. I do not know yet. I know only that I cannot return to believing what I now recognize as false. The Germany that emerges from this defeat will need to be fundamentally different from the one that started this conflict. Whether I can contribute to building something better, or whether I am too complicit in what came before, I cannot say. The meeting concluded with Richter providing detailed information about fuel logistics, maintenance schedules, and mechanical vulnerabilities that would prove valuable in understanding German operational limitations. As he was being escorted back to the prisoner facility, he paused once more at the doorway, looking back at Carter. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but ignorance and ideology. I was wrong, and I apologize for that wrongness. More than that, I thank you for not responding with the anger that would have been justified. Your patience in the face of my prejudice demonstrated a strength of character that I am still trying to understand. I hope that whatever world emerges from this conflict will have no place for the kind of stupidity I displayed. Carter met his eyes levelly. I hope that too, Oberleutnant, for everyone's sake. The world needs to be rebuilt on better foundations than the ones that led to this catastrophe. That's going to require people on all sides recognizing their failures and working to do better. After Richter departed, Henderson and Morris remained in the office with Carter for several minutes, discussing the encounter and its implications. Henderson expressed profound respect for how Carter had handled the situation, noting that he had achieved something remarkable, changing a man's understanding of fundamental truths through nothing but knowledge, patience, and dignity. The war in Europe continued through the bitter winter and into the spring of 1945, with German resistance gradually collapsing under overwhelming pressure from east and west. The 761st Tank Battalion participated in operations that pushed deeper into Germany, their modified tanks performing exactly as Carter had predicted. The improvements in reliability and efficiency contributed to operational success in ways that were difficult to quantify precisely, but were undeniably real. Carter's innovations were indeed standardized across multiple divisions, with thousands of tanks receiving the modifications before the conflict's end. His name appeared in technical bulletins and official reports, a small but significant recognition of individual achievement within the vast machinery of military operations. Other African-American soldiers and units also distinguished themselves, gradually forcing the American military to acknowledge capabilities it had long denied or dismissed. The European conflict ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For Carter and the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, victory was bittersweet. They had proven themselves thoroughly, had demonstrated courage and competence that exceeded many white units, had earned decorations and commendations, yet they knew they would return to an America that still maintained rigid racial hierarchies, that still denied them full equality despite their service and sacrifice. Carter mustered out in late 1945 and returned to Alabama, where he discovered that opportunities remained constrained by racial realities, that military service had not changed. The technical skills and knowledge he had developed were valued in theory but complicated in practice by social systems that resisted placing black men in positions of authority or visibility. He worked for several years in his father's garage, applying advanced engineering knowledge to civilian repairs while also becoming active in civil rights organizations, understanding that technical excellence alone would not dismantle systemic discrimination. Eventually, opportunities emerged as American industry recognized it could not afford to waste talent, and as civil rights activism gradually opened doors that had been firmly closed. Carter built a career in automotive engineering, contributing to advances that bore his influence even when they did not carry his name. He maintained connections with some of the engineers and officers he had known during the conflict, relationships that spanned racial lines even as society remained largely segregated. The encounter with Richter became a story Carter occasionally shared with students and younger engineers, using it to illustrate both the persistence of prejudice and the power of knowledge to challenge false assumptions. He never learned what became of the German officer, whether Richter had carried his revelations forward into building a different kind of society or whether the comfort of forgetting had proved too attractive. But Carter kept the letter Richter had sent, along with his wartime technical notebooks, as artifacts of a moment when competence had proven more powerful than ideology. James William Carter passed away in 1994 at the age of 73, having lived to see some of the barriers he fought against begin to crumble, though many still remained. His technical contributions were documented in engineering journals, his military service recorded in historical accounts, his life representing one thread in the larger tapestry of African-American achievement in the face of systematic discrimination. The fundamental truth he demonstrated in that Belgian warehouse endured, that excellence emerges from opportunity and effort, that capability recognizes no racial boundaries, that societies built on false hierarchies waste human potential and weaken themselves unnecessarily. It was a truth that needed continuous reaffirmation across generations because prejudice proved remarkably persistent even when confronted with overwhelming contrary evidence. The modified Sherman tanks that rolled through the final operations of the European conflict carried improvements developed by a black mechanic from Alabama whose knowledge exceeded that of supposedly superior German engineers. The German officer, who had dismissed Carter based on ignorant assumptions, had been forced to confront the falsehood of his worldview, and the larger conflict had been decided not just by industrial capacity, but by fundamental differences between societies that could utilize their full human potential and those that artificially limited themselves through ideologies of exclusion. In the end, the story was about more than engines and engineering, more than one encounter between two men on opposite sides of a conflict. It was about the slow, difficult process through which individuals and societies learn to recognize excellence wherever it emerges, to value contribution regardless of origin, to build systems on truth rather than comfortable falsehoods. It was about the quiet courage required to maintain dignity in the face of dismissal, to prove oneself repeatedly to audiences determined to deny one's worth, to transform prejudice through undeniable competence. The warehouse in Spa where it happened was likely torn down decades ago, replaced or abandoned, with nothing to mark what occurred there. The people who witnessed the exchange have mostly passed away, their memories joining the vast unrecorded history of small moments that collectively shaped larger transformations. But the truth demonstrated there persists, waiting for each generation to rediscover, that human capability cannot be constrained by artificial boundaries, that knowledge is power, that excellence speaks louder than ideology. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.